because I don't think there's anyone in the room here who's teaching chemistry that I know of, at least not at Oakland. Let me tell you a little bit about general chemistry 2 and what it's about. This is a gateway course with a high failure rate, high enrollment classes. So I have 2 sections and each of them has about 120 students. That's the cap, and mine was filled up with a waiting list. So I had a total of 240 students at the beginning of the semester in winter. Traditionally, it's been taught in person, in large part because there is a lab component of the course that's a co-requisite. And mainly it's freshmen, not 100%, partly because you've had that failure rate, so you get the repeat students. And it's high grade pressure because a lot of the students taking this Gen Chem 1, Gen Chem 2 sequence are pre-med, pre-pharma, pre-professionals, where it's a requirement, and they're very obviously concerned about how they do in the course so that they can hopefully then apply to medical school or wherever later on. I would estimate, and I tell students this at the beginning, the very first day of class, that it's roughly an order of magnitude more difficult than the prerequisite Gen Chem 1, in large part because it's not only a math-based class, but it is also much more conceptual. And so in Gen Chem 1, students can oftentimes kind of follow a pattern. They can imitate. They see something that is similar every time, and they can get in that kind of routine. This class, you have to analyze the problems much more to kind of figure out what to do before you can even set up the math equation, for example. And so it is much more difficult. And then it is a prerequisite for future classes, higher level or chemistry classes, including organic chemistry. So because of the difficulty of the course content and the fact that it's normally taught in person, in the past, I didn't used to ever have quizzes. Gen Chem 1, I teach in-person quizzes or have in-person quizzes to give the students a deadline and keep them on task because they're freshmen and they need to have that hard deadline or they'll procrastinate. By Gen Chem 2, I figured they should have figured it out. And so, I wanted to use my class time for teaching and doing extra practice problems to help them master the content. But when COVID hit and everything was online, I said, well, I should create Moodle quizzes. We want to spread out the assessments. So that's where I came up with Moodle quizzes during COVID. And then I've just kept them because it's like, well, I've already got them created. It's not too hard to modify them a little bit. So, and as you all know, because of the pressure for the expense, these are unproctored quizzes. So what I have is a chapter quiz for each of the 8 chapters. They don't have a huge point value. They get to drop their 2 lowest scores. They're slightly time pressured. I say only when I say time pressured, it's actually the same amount of minutes per question that they'll have for their future exams, but it feels pressured because it has one-way navigation. And so, I don't give them any extra time because of the fact that there's one-way navigation, et cetera. So the way I design my quizzes is each question that goes into the quiz is actually a separate category where I pull a random one question from the category. So if I have the titles that kind of match. So you can see the first one, calculation freezing point. So I will have multiple versions where I've changed the numbers or the chemical substances or things, but it's essentially the same question. So nobody can say my quiz is more, easier or harder than the other person. All the questions then are scrambled and the answers are scrambled. So each student gets a unique quiz. And then as an additional factor, I have them upload their written work afterwards for things that are calculations. They're labeled to let them know. They're all multiple choice. And then the students take this, it's a 36-minute quiz for 10 questions, and it's within a 24-hour period. So they can take it whenever they want during that one-day time frame. But once they start it, obviously they have to keep going. So what I noticed was I looked at the grade distribution after the first quiz. And if you look at this distribution that's shown here, this is the winter 24 grade, quiz 1 grade distribution. And if you teach a gateway course, this should not look terribly unfamiliar to you. You might think that's terrible. For those of you who teach other easier, shall we say, or less, not a gateway course, this might look really awful. This is typical, okay? 60% average, the grades are all over the map. If you look at what happened for this winter semester, here's how the distribution looks. You can see it has shifted almost 20% higher than it was a year ago. And it's essentially the same quiz. I mean, all I've done is I've tweaked the questions a little bit, right? It's very, very similar. Lots of 8s, 9s, and 10s. So there's something going on because things don't change that much when you teach. I've been teaching this course for 15 years plus. You don't have this kind of a shift without some reason. Other things that came along with it that gave me a sign that something had changed was when I looked at what were the most missed questions from the quiz. And these things, again, they tend to be the same questions historically, kind of what do they call it? Perennial problems, if you will. And so this is now for the second quiz, because it was an easier one to kind of demonstrate the difference. So the question on the left, you can see is a calculation-based question, even though I didn't show the work you come up to it. You're given information and you have to calculate a rate constant that's at a different temperature. It's known as the Arrhenius calculation. It involves logarithms, so they have to do, it's a lot of math, and there's a lot of common mistakes that happen in that problem. At the end of it, for those of you who teach other math questions, or if you're from your own learning in the past, at the end you have to do like an e to the x, a multiplier that multiplies against the value you started with. Well, if they mess up the unit, so the value that's given here is in kilojoules per mole, if they don't correctly change that to joules per mole to match up with the gas constant, you get a multiplier that effectively is equivalent to 1. Whether it's positive or negative, it doesn't matter. It comes out to something. So your multiplier gives you a value that's 1, and you end up with the same answer you started with. That's the common mistake that this student made in this example. Other mistakes are in the course of the math. Students will mess up the sign on the exponent. So instead of it being bumped up to be larger than it started with, they get something that's a fractional value, even the minus x instead of the plus x, for example. And so all those wrong answer choices are available for them to pick. So that's why this is traditionally a missed question. Well, what came up as the most missed question this year, instead of the calculation being most missed, the graphical interpretation question. And if this is really an extremely simple question, if you simply know how to interpret the information, they have a formula sheet that tells them, y equals mx plus b layout for what it is, y being natural log of k, x is 1 over temperature. And if they just know how to interpret what the variables stand for, all I'm really asking them to pick is which of the lines has the highest y-intercept. And so it's a very straightforward thing to interpret, but artificial intelligence is not good at interpreting graphs. This is one of my, unwritten conclusions at the end of the talk here. So if you want to stump AI, give it a graph question. There were other things that supported that something wasn't quite right with the performance of the students being so much higher. For example, in the past, after the first quiz, I get lots and lots of emails about how they didn't have enough time to finish. Well, nobody was complaining about not having enough time to finish. And other things like noticing that people would take their quiz late in the day and they're getting 9s and 10s, and it only took them 15 minutes instead of 36. And then they had perfect work that supported their answers, so they didn't seem to struggle with that. But I also noticed that the work that they turned in didn't necessarily match the way that I taught them in class. They're using like a canned formula, just plug and chug, instead of like if you're doing a molar mass calculation where you need both grams and moles, and you're given grams and milligrams, and then you have to find the mole value by calculating it from the information given and then put the two together. They're just using one formula and putting it all together. So they found something probably on the internet. All right, well, after the second quiz, I then went on and decided I should take a look at the correlation between the quiz scores and their exam scores. Now, remember that while the quizzes are online, my exams are in person. I assign seats for exams so they can't be sitting next to their buddies. I have multiple versions, even though they are multiple choice again, et cetera. So I have a lot of control in the classroom because of the way I design my seating chart. And so this is just to show what the quiz scores looked like a year ago, winter 24 quiz versus the first two quiz score on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, the exam score. And you can see the R-squared is just shy of 0.5. It's not a great correlation, but it certainly has the trend it should. And you would expect to have some scatter because ideally the quizzes are designed that you hopefully if you make mistakes on the quizzes because you've never taken this stuff before, you learn from them and improve. So you'd like to see students in this kind of, I don't know, lower right corner where like they learned from their mistakes and they did better on the exam than they did on the quizzes. Of course, you got a few people that did the opposite, but at least it follows the trend as expected. If you look at this year, there's no correlation. R-squared of only 0.07 is pathetic. So it's kind of like the online homework that we assign that we don't expect it to correlate, because anybody who puts in the effort in online homework should get an A if you give them multiple attempts and their open notes and all that kind of stuff. I would never try to look at that, but this is essentially what it's looking like here. I actually showed this data to my students. That perhaps is a mistake, because it's like I kind of let them know, I know you're cheating and I'm not going to be able to do anything about it. But I just figured I wanted to warn people. As I said, look, if you're in the upper left corner here, I got a message for you. If you cheat on the quizzes, you will fail the exams. And so you better rethink this and figure out that these quizzes are the tool to help you do better. So I tried to turn it into a positive message to say, I don't want to see you fail, and you're not helping yourself to learn by taking the shortcut. Okay, so here's the good news. If you look at, I told you that my Gen Chem 1 course, I actually do the in-person quizzes. I don't assign seats for those, so they could be sitting next to their buddies, and there's only 10 questions on one piece of paper, both sides. It's not much I can scramble, even when I have multiple versions. So it's still not perfect, but the R squared is again about 0.5, so it's a reasonable correlation. That was from fall of 2024. So the good news about this is to give me confidence, or to say that it looks like our in-person assessments still have integrity in terms of quizzes. And so that's encouraging, I think. All right, so what does this all say? Well, it's not surprising that the most likely explanation is that the students are using AI. You can't even do a Google search without it popping up. Even on my phone, everything, it just wants to give me an AI summary without asking for it. So it doesn't take much. And our ELIS expert in the room might be able to educate me on what things I could have done differently to prevent, but I'm not sure it would matter in terms of deterrence. I've not had the, try to lock down the browser, because I figured they've got multiple things going on anyway, really. If they take a screenshot and search it with their phone, they're still going to get somewhere, because you don't have proctoring. So AI is super fast. The other thing is that with Chegg out there and Course Hero and all these other things, I am quite sure that students who take the quiz early in the day are probably posting their questions to Chegg, and by late in the day, all those answers are out there, and they can share the information whether I like it or not. And there's not a whole lot I can do about that either. And then finally, to make matters worse, of course, students can instantly collaborate because of the many group messaging things. I have even had students send out an email to me accidentally, where I have like they don't hear me, my student account, like I am a fake student in my own course. And they've sent out the group to everybody in the course and saying, hey, do you want to join our Discord or whatever for the class? Group me. And at first I hadn't even heard of it the first time they did it, but so I know they do this, and that's okay. We want them to collaborate in the right ways. So unfortunately, those are most likely the explanations for why this data has changed so much. So what are the obvious solutions? Reduce the weighting. At the time for this semester, not knowing this was going to happen, my quizzes are weighted as 20% of their grade, which is rather high. That was an unfortunate thing, but there's a silver lining I'll share here in a moment. So either reduce the weighting, or the other possibility, which wouldn't be practical from my point of view, would be to use in-person assessments. I really don't want to use up my class time. I could go back to having none of them, because that's what I did prior to having the quizzes in this class. I would post what I would call a practice quiz. And so it was just a PDF file with open-ended questions, and then maybe some multiple choice to give them a flavor for what to expect. And then I would post an answer key, and I would tell them, sit down, take it as if you were taking it in a classroom with just, a periodic table and a formula sheet and your calculator, time yourself, and then grade yourself. And that was the way that I handled things. But I probably will just kind of go down to very low weighting and, continue to use them, but probably make them like 5% or something. We'll see. I have a year to figure it out. So the silver lining for me, or my saving grace, as I say here on the slide, is that I have had for years in my syllabus the requirement that they have to have at least a minimum 50% exam average, because even with in-person quizzes, I know there's some cheating going on between friends sitting near each other and whatever. And so with that 50% exam average, if they cheat all the way through and they haven't really learned the material, they're not likely to make it through. Without going into too much detail, I'll just mention I did have a means of screening the students I was most suspicious about. I gave them selective seats in the classroom for their exams. I had about 24 students I was keeping an eye on in my 2 classes. And out of those, I think only about 2 of them actually passed the class. And they had to earn that grade. For those who did manage to make it through and shouldn't have perhaps, I think the grade bump was at most about a half a grade. So they went from the C to the C+. This still isn't going to get them into med school, so I'm not really going to lose too much sleep over it. But anyway, and it's not that I wish them to fail, don't get me wrong. It's just I really want students to earn the grade, because it's not fair to all the students who are doing all the right things and working really hard. And to that end, I did bump up one student. I always have a little grace in my grading scheme at the end of the semester as I curve the final and all that. I had one student who was like one of my grace questions away from making it through the class. She came to office hours every week, and when I looked at her quiz average, which was matching her exam average, it was like on the 50 to 60%. It was just on the brink of passing. I said, she deserves to get through because she was honest. So that student got a little tiny bump. Anyway, and then she was the only one in that category. But that was my compensation. Anyway, thank you for your time. I hope this was enlightening, and I'm happy to hear your questions.